time to alienate and upset another portion of my already meager audience. Seriously, remember guys, this is just my thoughts. Take it with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, I'm still just some dumb guy ranting into a microphone on the internet. Anyway, science fiction and fantasy, while existing to achieve the similar goal of making the impossible possible, in my eyes function in entirely different ways. And yet, in our modern culture, these two genres are considered by many to be interchangeable. Often, I find movies and TV shows that are labeled and categorized as both at the same time, to which I have to say, are you kidding me? You can't be serious. They couldn't be more different. Science fiction is defined as fiction based on imagined future scientific or technological advances and major social or environmental changes, frequently portraying space or time travel and life on other planets. While fantasy is described as... See, this is my problem with fantasy right here. There isn't even a clear, comprehensive definition of it. It could be modern, medieval, minimal, all-encompassing, or just pertain to strange creatures. Fantasy can manifest in so many different ways you can't even define it specifically. You just know it when you see it. The fact that one is definable and one just isn't is very symbolic for both of these genres. While one is almost defined by its limitations in order to remain grounded in reality and plausibility, the other remains free and more open to new possibilities. But... okay, so I guess it's important that I share my personal thoughts and biases on these genres. I'm a bit of a sci-fi nerd, in case you couldn't tell. But as a child, I loved both science fiction and fantasy. Harry Potter in particular was something I was very into, and I still am today to a certain extent. So it can't be said that I have no capacity to suspend disbelief. But as time went on, I became more disenchanted with fantasy. And let me just say that if you love fantasy, I totally respect that. Nothing I say is meant to undermine that, and my intention for this video is not to change your mind. You are entitled to enjoy whatever you like. Life is short and happiness is rare, so if fantasy brings you that happiness, more power to you. That being said, fantasy makes absolutely no sense. Like, what? What is this? Are you even trying? Now, in an effort to keep this fair, not all fantasy is bad, and when it's done right, it's incredible. Tolkien, for example, had a vast history and legacy for every race he created, and often dabbled in metaphors and heavy symbolism. And film and TV franchises like Harry Potter, Full Metal Alchemist, and Avatar: The Last Airbender have various rules and regulations and boundaries for the use of its magic or fantastical abilities, which gives it an aura of realism and sense. Which, interestingly enough, all sound like the best elements of science fiction as well, but I suppose you can't say these traits belong to any one genre. Perhaps these are just traits of good writing in general. So, this isn't to say fantasy can't be done right. In fact, I'm kind of a big fan of everything I just listed. And, well, there's even an argument to be made that H.P. Lovecraft, a man who many consider one of the great fathers of science fiction, is actually more of a fantasy writer. As a fan of his work, this thought often sends me spiraling into existential terror, just as he would have always wanted. But anyway, my point is, fantasy can be great, but there are certain tropes and cliches and unspoken rules in all of fantasy that we've simply come to accept. It's these elements that I take issue with, and often ruin this genre for me. For example, so you can shoot some form of energy out of a stick or blast a shockwave from your staff. How and why does it do that? There are no moving parts, no circuitry, no emitters. Where does this energy come from? The universe? Nature? Your soul? Do you even know? Fantasy is obsessed with glowing stuff, but never tells you what it is or where it comes from. So there's this massive society of magic users hidden among the common folk. How in the name of sanity can you hope to keep a cover-up of such scale? Do you honestly think no one will attempt to uproot that or cause trouble? There will always exist those who disobey rules, and in this case, they're extremely powerful. Okay, so orcs, elves, and other races and creatures exist. Where did they come from? How did they evolve? Is this supposed to be our world? They certainly don't exist currently. So what, is this a parallel universe? Another planet? Again, do you even know? So you live in a medieval world full of magic. Why have you not developed technology? Physics and reality seem to be the same here, so who's to say telephones, computers, and cars can't exist simultaneously? And the list just goes on and on. But what's the most common answer to these questions? Because magic. Why can that car fly? How can he shapeshift at will? Why does transmutation work here? Why do dragons exist? How is any of this possible? The only answer anyone ever gives me is...
because magic.
Because magic is not an answer. Things like this don't just pop into existence for no reason. There has to be an explanation. If not, isn't that just poor writing? Magic can't just be some Swiss Army plot device that creates and resolves issues at will. And, I think that's my biggest problem with many forms of fantasy, and why a lot of modern fantasy is so awful. It's used as a crutch by those who don't know how to write a good story. Often there's no structure, and it's all just flash and no substance. It seems like most movie writers think that by labeling something as fantasy, that means they no longer have to put work into the world building, so they just focus on spectacle. Any reason to put a huge CGI dragon in New York or show off the newest particle effects. Why spend all that time writing out the why and how things happen when you can just say, because magic? When your audience can't predict, or at the very least understand, how your world works, because seemingly anything can happen, and the writer keeps creating new spells and abilities at random that the audience was not made aware of, how can they become invested? How can they relate to your characters? Nothing's consistent. I'm assuming this is an intelligently thinking audience, and not the same people who go to see Transformers movies just to watch CGI robots clang together, or scantily clad girls of questionable age. Oftentimes, I'll be rewatching the Harry Potter films and think to myself, boy, that random spell they're using as a background element would sure have been useful 2 movies ago. That's just what happens when you write so much stuff thoughtlessly. Magic is often handled like children playing pretend at recess, who continue to come up with more and more powerful moves to outdo each other. Oddly enough, in seemingly a pathetic attempt at resolving this issue, in recent years a new crossbreed of fantasy has emerged onto the scene. For the purpose of this video, I'll call it faux science fiction. This has become very common in the young adult genre. Essentially, it's a fantasy story with vague science fiction elements overlaid onto it to make it appear more realistic. To which my response is, stay in your lane, fantasy! Often, this results in weak storytelling, vague world building, and contradictory plot elements. And unfortunately, this is what the youth of today are growing up on. Children that will grow up to create the next generation of media. And if they think this is good storytelling, which they apparently do, this is what they will recreate. Low effort, high concept, soulless spectacle. Yikes. That describes most of cinema anymore. Alright, that wraps up this video. If you liked it, be sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. As usual, I would like to thank my patrons for their continued support. And as always, thanks for watching.